All right, diving in today, folks, we're going deep, deep into medieval philosophy.
Deep, deep indeed.
But with someone maybe you haven't encountered too much before, William of Auvergne.
Oh, fascinating figure.
Yeah, pivotal, actually, to how things developed.
Absolutely, yeah.
13th century became the Bishop of Paris, which, no small feat in itself.
No, no, certainly not.
And, at the time, we have this incredible influx of texts being translated
Yeah.
from Greek, Islamic, and Jewish philosophical traditions.
Mm.
And so he's one of the first in the Latin West that really gets to grapple with these new ideas at the time.
It's almost like, imagine that, right? You've got this whole philosophical landscape, and then suddenly, boom, these incredibly rich, incredibly complex ideas from all these different traditions, and you're trying to make sense of them. You're trying to see how they fit, or maybe they don't fit with your own beliefs.
Especially as bishop.
Right. I mean, talk about pressure. You're not just a philosopher, you're a leader of the church, and you've got to figure out how to engage with these potentially, well, at the time, revolutionary ideas, while also safeguarding, I guess you could say, the integrity of Christian faith.
So where are we going to learn about this guy?
Well, luckily, there's a great resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, perfect.
They have an excellent entry on William of Auvergne, really thorough, covers his life, his main works, and of course the key ideas.
Perfect. So that's going to be our main source, our guide for this deep dive.
Exactly. And I think, for our listeners who really like getting into those deep philosophical questions, this is going to be a treat. We're going to get to see how these foundational concepts, being reality, the soul, all of these things were wrestled with in this incredibly vibrant period, and through the mind of someone who's really, on the front lines of these intellectual battles, so to speak.
Okay, so who was this guy? You say he became bishop, so clearly ambitious.
That's right. But his early life, it's a bit hazy. Some historians think he might have come from humble beginnings, Auvergne region of France.
Okay.
But he obviously shined academically because by the mid-1220s, he's a theology professor at the University of Paris. And then things get interesting. 1228, election for the Bishop of Paris. First choice gets challenged, second choice, same thing. And William, what does he do? Appeals directly to the Pope.
Bold move.
Right. And it worked. The Pope was so impressed with William, his knowledge, his virtue, the whole package. He actually overturned the election, ordained William a priest, and boom, made him bishop.
Talk about a meteoric rise.
Absolutely. But as you can imagine, being bishop wasn't all, smooth sailing. 1229, huge student riot in Paris.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, caused tension with the Pope, who apparently started having second thoughts about his choice. But even with these ups and downs, William also did important work for the Pope, taking on various missions.
And, of course, there's the condemnation of the Talmud in 1239.
Right, a very a dark chapter in his story. Accusations of heresy against the Talmud. William gets involved. And this unfortunately led to the Pope ordering the confiscation and burning of Jewish sacred texts in 1242.
So, yeah, a complex legacy for sure. He died in 1249, still bishop.
Right.
Okay, so let's get to his writings, his philosophical work. What's the big one we should focus on?
His magnum opus, a 7-part work called Magisterium Divinale et Sapientiale, which basically means teaching on God in the mode of wisdom. It's a huge undertaking, incredibly ambitious, trying to bring together, synthesize all this knowledge.
I mean, 7 parts. That sounds pretty comprehensive.
Oh, it is. But for our purposes, I'd say the first 3 parts are the most philosophical, and those are on the Trinity, or the first principle, on the universe, and on the soul. What's interesting is, in these sections, William actually says he wants to proceed using the paths of proofs, meaning he's going to rely on philosophical reasoning and argumentation, not just on, divine revelation.
Interesting. So setting some ground rules for his approach, like, hey, I'm going to use logic and reason here.
Exactly. He's not just saying this is what Scripture says. He's trying to build a philosophical case. And his writing style, it's unique for the time. You see a lot of his contemporaries, they were using this question and answer format very structured, almost like a back and forth.
Ah, okay.
But William, he writes more like a continuous treatise, much more like Avicenna or Avispron, if you're familiar with them. Lots of analogies, metaphors, vivid imagery, and he's not afraid to be, blunt, let's say, in his opinions. He's not pulling any punches, when he disagrees with someone.
So not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
Definitely not. And that's what makes him so interesting to read. But it can also make it tricky to always be sure what he's really saying. Because sometimes the metaphor, it's powerful, but the philosophical argument behind it, it's not always clear.
Ah, okay. So to his metaphysics. He's got some strong views on being and reality. Where does he start?
Well, right off the bat, he dives into this really important distinction between esse being itself and essentiate, the essence of a thing.
Okay.
Now, he's heavily influenced here by Boethius, especially by Avicenna. This is like early on the Trinity. And the central point for William is that everything that exists, everything except for God, it's a combination of its essence, so like what it is, its definition, and its being, its actual existence.
Okay.
And for William, that being the essence, it's something received, something participated in, and the source of all being, God.
Right.
God, on the other hand, is totally different. In God, there is no such composition. His essence is his being. They're one and the same.
So right from the start, he's drawing a very clear line.
Absolutely. There's this fundamental ontological divide between God and everything else.
Okay, so can we unpack that a little more? You mentioned being by participation versus being by substance.
Right, right. So William borrows the distinction from Boethius about things being good by participation or good by their substance. He uses this to talk about being. So you have ens participation, a being that exists by participation, and then you have ens substantia, or ens per essentium, a being that exists by its own substance, by its essence.
Okay, I'm following.
Now think of essence as like the core definition of a thing. It's whatness. William, following Avicenna, calls this the quidditas, this whatness. It's the quod est, literally that which is.
Got it.
And the being, the esse, it's the quo est, by which it is.
Interesting.
So for all these things that exist by participation, which is everything except God, their essence and their existence, they're separate.
Okay.
To make it a little clearer, William uses this really cool analogy. Imagine being is like clothing.
Okay.
So for us, existence, it's like we're wearing this clothing. It's not like our actual skin, right?
Yeah.
But for God, his being, it is his skin. It's inseparable from him.
Wow, that's a very vivid way to put it.
Right. So for created things, existence is like this added layer. It's something they receive, something they participate in. William he even sometimes calls this participated being accidental, not because it's like unimportant, but because it's not part of the thing's core essence.
Okay, I get it. It's not like a defining characteristic.
Exactly. Now, being by substance, that's a whole different story. It doesn't participate in being at all. It is its being. William has this great line where he says, it's a being whose essence is for it being, and whose essence we predicate when we say it is, so that it itself and its being are one thing in every way.
So a self-sufficient existence, in a way.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that, as you might have guessed, is what he attributes to God.
Right. So God is the only one that has this being by substance.
Exactly. He even goes further and argues that there has to be such a being whose essence is to be. Because think about it. If everything got its being by participation, where would it all end up?
Okay. I'm seeing where you're going.
Right. Either you'd have this weird circle where beings are like borrowing being from each other forever, which makes no sense.
Like a cosmic game of hot potato.
Haha, exactly. Or you'd have this infinite chain where A gets being from B, which gets being from C, and so on, forever and ever.
And never reaching a source.
Right. And Williams says that if that were the case, being itself wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be intelligible because there would be no foundation, no starting point. So he concludes there has to be a being that's the source of its own being, a being that's self-sufficient.
And that fits in with this whole idea of God as the ultimate explanation, right?
Exactly. Philosophers, they always want to get to the bottom of things, find the fundamental principles, and for William, that principle is God. Now, he also talks about other distinctions related to being, like need versus sufficiency.
Right. Yeah.
He lists 16 of them, including possible versus necessary, false versus true, flowing versus lasting.
And these are all connected to the essence participation distinction.
Absolutely. He sees them all as being, woven together, interconnected. So, for example, something with being of need, like a creature, it participates in being. But something with being of sufficiency, God, it's being. And he argues that you can often figure out one side of these distinctions if you know the other. He borrows a lot from Avicenna here, but the core idea is always the same. Does something receive its being, or is it being?
Makes sense. And I think, especially for a philosopher, the idea of possible versus necessary being is really key here.
Oh, definitely. William, again, following Avicenna, defines a possible being not just as something that, could exist, but as something whose essence doesn't automatically mean it has to exist or can't exist. It's like its essence is open to both possibilities.
Interesting. So it's not predetermined. Okay.
Exactly. And he even says that possible beings, they're in a way logically prior to their actual being, like their essence is there first, and then they might receive being or not.
Ah,
And for those possible beings that do come to exist, their possibility, their essence, and their actuality, their being, they're really distinct. That being is something added on. It's not part of the essence itself.
so you could say for everything except God, there's this gap between what it is and that it is.
Beautifully put. And then you have being necessary through itself. That's like the ultimate kind of being for William, the kind of being that can't not exist. And he says there can only be one of those.
Which is, of course, God.
Exactly. Because this being, its being is its essence. And he says that because of that, it has to be absolutely simple, no parts, no divisions. If there were two or more absolutely simple beings, there would be nothing to tell them apart.
They would be indistinguishable.
Exactly. And this simplicity, it comes from the fact that this being can't be caused by anything else. Anything that's caused has to be different from its being. So God as being by substance has to be absolutely simple.
And this simplicity also affects how William thinks about God's attributes.
Right. Oh, absolutely. So he argues that God can't be a universal, like a genus or species, because those imply some kind of composition, some kind of parts.
Oh, yeah.
Individuals that belong to a universal, they have a quidditas, a definition that, again, implies parts, but William still says that God is an individual. He believes everything that exists has to be either a universal or an individual. So God is an individual, but unlike any other, absolutely simple and unique.
And how does he get from this idea of God to God's will and knowledge?
He starts with God's power. He says God is omnipotent, meaning he can do anything. But he takes it a step further. He says God has this two-way power. He can do something or he cannot do it. He connects this to Aristotle's idea of rational powers. And because this power can go either way, William says it needs choice. And that means God must have a will. And to choose, you need to know, right? So God must also be omniscient, all-knowing.
Okay, that's a pretty tight argument. But if God's will is truly free, how does that fit with his absolute simplicity? Could he have willed something different, known something different, without being different himself?
That's a great question, and something William himself struggles with. His solution, he says that the act of knowing or willing in God, that's not separate from God. It's identical with him. It's unchanging.
Okay.
But the object of that act, what God knows or wills, that can change. So God himself doesn't change, but what he directs his will or knowledge towards, that can be different.
So the act is eternal and unchanging, but the content, so to speak, can vary.
Exactly. That's how he tries to keep God simple while also acknowledging his free will.
All right, so that gives us a good foundation for William's metaphysics. Now, how does this understanding of God shape his view of God's relationship with creation?
Well, for William, God is the source of all being. Everything that exists, its very being, comes from him.
Yeah.
But how that dependence works exactly, that's something he admits can be hard to describe. Sometimes he talks about God's being as like the foundation of everything. Like if you could strip away all the characteristics of a creature, what you'd be left with is pure being, and that's God.
Almost like a pantheistic view, where God is everything.
Right, and William knew people might interpret it that way. So he's careful to qualify his statements. He says it's hard to define exactly how God is present in creation. And in other places, he really emphasizes God's transcendence, his separateness from creation. He often uses the analogy of light and emitted light. They're different, but they're connected.
Like the sun and its rays.
Exactly. So the being of creatures, it's like a reflection and emanation of the divine light.
Interesting. Now, he also spends quite a bit of time refuting the Manichees. Why is that important in this context?
Because the Manichees believed in two principles, good and evil. And William saw that as a direct attack on the idea of a single, all-good God as the creator.
So a direct challenge to his whole system.
Exactly. And William says, yeah, good can't directly create evil, but it can create things that lead to evil indirectly. He uses examples like drunkenness from wine. Wine is good, but it can be misused.
And he's got a metaphysical argument too, right?
Right. He says a first principle has to be a necessary being, and there can only be one of those. And besides, he says the whole idea of a creative evil principle doesn't make sense, because creation itself implies bringing something good into being.
So you can't have evil as the source of creation.
Precisely. Now, this whole discussion of creation leads us to another tricky question: causation. How do creatures fit into this chain of cause and effect?
Right. If God is the ultimate source of being, do creatures really have any causal power?
And that's where things get A little controversial. William famously says that the creator alone properly and truly is worthy of the title cause, but other things are merely messengers and bearers of the last things received as if sent from the creator.
So are creatures just puppets then?
That's what some scholars think he's saying. They argue that he denies what we call secondary causation, the idea that creatures can cause things on their own.
But that seems to go against, well, everything we experience, right?
It does, and that's why some other scholars disagree. They say he's just using a really strict definition of cause. Maybe he's allowing for kind of a limited or dependent causal agency in creatures, but it's clear he sees true causation as linked to the giving of being, and creatures, they receive being, they don't give it.
So even if they act, it's ultimately God acting through them.
Exactly. Like we see the gears turning, but it's always God turning the crank, so to speak.
And that leads us to his rejection of Avicenna's emanationism.
Right. Avicenna had this idea that God creates indirectly through a series of intellectual beings. It's like a chain where God creates the first intelligence, which creates the next one, and so on, until you get to the agent intellect, which creates the material world.
So a kind of trickle-down creation.
Yeah, and William really disliked that idea. He thought it limited God's power and freedom.
So no middlemen in creation for William.
No middlemen. He prefers a Vesperon's view, where God creates directly through his will. He uses this analogy of a potter and clay. The potter doesn't need anyone else to help him shape the clay. He does it himself.
And this emphasis on God's will leads him to two other important rejections, right?
Right. He argues against both the necessity of creation and the eternity of the world.
Both ideas that were pretty popular at the time, especially with philosophers like Aristotle and Avicenna.
Exactly. So first, William says creation wasn't necessary. Because God creates freely, he could have chosen not to create at all.
So God wasn't forced to create, it was a free choice.
Exactly. And second, he says the world isn't eternal, it had a beginning. Now, this was a big deal because it went against the grain of a lot of philosophical thought.
And it also aligned him with, the biblical account.
Right, and William really goes all out in refuting the idea of an eternal universe. He dedicates a lot of space to it and on the universe. He even carefully defines eternity and time to show how different they are.
So how does he define them?
He says, true eternity, that belongs only to God. It's his very being. It has no beginning, no end, no change. He describes it as remaining and standing still.
Yeah.
Time, on the other hand, it's constantly flowing, always changing. He even says it has a weak being because it's always disappearing.
So a stark contrast.
Yeah.
And how does he argue against the eternity of the world?
He has a few key arguments. One is about the very idea of possibility. He says the world is a possible being, meaning it didn't have to exist. So before it existed, there was non-being. And that means there had to be a point when it began.
So if it's possible for it not to be, then it must have begun to be at some point.
Exactly. And he also talks about the problems with the idea of an infinite path. Like, how could we even get to the present if the past is infinite?
Yeah.
And he points out paradoxes that come up when you think about time as an infinite thing. These arguments actually became really influential later on.
And before we move on from creation, he also talks about divine providence, right?
Yeah.
God's plan for the universe.
Yes. He sees it as God's active care for creation. It's not just knowing what will happen, it's actually guiding and sustaining everything. He makes a point of saying that providence only includes good. Evil happens because of free will or just as a consequence of how things work.
Like that wine example.
Exactly. But he doesn't think providence is just this general oversight. He says it extends to every single creature. Nothing happens by chance for God. He sees the universe as this grand, purposeful system. Even things that seem bad, like a spider eating a fly, they have a purpose.
Wow. So everything has its place in God's plan.
And for humans, our ultimate purpose is to be united with God. But of course, there's the problem of evil. If God is all good and he cares for everything, why is there so much suffering?
Right, that's a tough one.
It is. William follows the Augustinian tradition here. He says there are two kinds of evil. First, there's evil that comes from people choosing to do bad things. That's our fault, not God's. And second, there's evil that's just part of the natural world or that happens as punishment. But William says those kinds of evil, they ultimately serve a good purpose. Like pain can teach us to avoid harmful things.
So it's all part of God's plan, even if we don't understand it.
Exactly. He also talks about how providence and free will fit together. He examines ideas like fate and determinism, but he rejects them. He says we really do have free will. And he makes a distinction between things being necessary for individuals and things being necessary for God's overall plan. He says people who argue against free will, they mix those two up.
Okay, so that covers William's metaphysics and his view of creation. Now, let's get to his views on the soul.
Right.
He wrote a whole treatise on that, didn't he?
He did, and
Yeah.
it's a major work, especially for its time. It's called On the Soul. He starts by talking about Aristotle's definition of the soul, the perfection of an organic body potentially having life. But William's view is much more influenced by Avicenna and even has some Platonic elements in it. So he interprets Aristotle's words in a specific way. He says organic means the body is like a tool for the soul, and potentially having life refers to a dead body, one that doesn't have a soul anymore.
Interesting.
But the key difference is this. Aristotle thought the soul was the form of the body, like the shape that gives matter its specific properties. William says, no, the soul is a substance. It's a separate thing, an individual entity. It can exist on its own without the body.
So that's a pretty big departure from Aristotle.
Huge. And it's a very Platonic idea, this idea of the soul being separate from the body. And then the question becomes, well, how do we know souls exist? How do we know they're these separate substances?
Right. What evidence does he offer?
Well, he has a few arguments. One is that bodies are like instruments. They need something to use them. You need a hand to play a piano, right? So the soul is like the musician and the body is the instrument.
Okay.
And for the human soul, the rational soul, he points to our ability to understand and know things. He says those abilities can't come from the body. They need something non-physical. They need a soul.
And those arguments, they also show that the soul isn't just a power, but a thing itself.
Exactly. He's arguing for the substantiality of the soul. He even says the soul is the same as the human being, the I.
So he's really putting the emphasis on the soul here, not the body.
Absolutely. And to prove that the soul isn't material, he uses a thought experiment from Avicenna. Imagine a person who's created all of a sudden in midair with no senses. Would they still be aware of themselves?
I guess so, right. They'd still have thoughts, even if they couldn't see or hear anything.
Exactly. And that means their awareness, their soul, it can't be dependent on the body. He also has a more general argument. He says if the body was the source of life, it would need to be alive itself, which would mean it needs a soul. And that would just go on forever. Souls needing souls.
An infinite regress of souls.
Exactly. And that wouldn't make any sense. So the soul must be something different, something non-material.
And you mentioned that William really downplays the role of the body. He equates the human being with the soul, almost as if the body is just an accessory.
He does. He uses all these metaphors to describe the body. He calls it a house for the soul, a prison, even a cloak. He says we tend to define humans in terms of their bodies, but that's just a superficial way of looking at it.
Like judging a book by its cover.
Exactly. And he says the soul and body, they're not really one thing, not in the same way a single human being is one thing. Plus, he says the soul is what gets rewarded or punished in the afterlife. So it must be the real us, the thing that's responsible for our actions.
Okay, so he's got strong arguments for the existence and immateriality of the soul. Now, what about its nature? Is it simple or is it made up of parts?
Well, he says souls are super simple, some of the simplest things God created. But like everything created, they have to have some kind of composition.
But not a material composition, right?
Right. He rejects this idea of universal hylomorphism, which says that even spiritual things are made of form and some kind of spiritual matter.
So no spiritual matter for William.
No way. He says prime matter, the stuff Aristotle talked about, that's only for physical things. Souls and angels, they're pure immaterial forms, he says. And he also denies that the soul has different powers, like intellect and will, that are separate from each other. He says they're all just the soul itself doing different things.
So the soul is one unified thing.
Exactly. But it does have one kind of composition. Remember that distinction between quod est and quo est?
The essence and existence.
That's the composition he sees in souls. It's not a material composition, but it's still a distinction between what the soul is and that it exists.
Okay, so that brings us to another interesting point. What did William think about the idea that humans have multiple souls?
Yeah, he really disliked that idea. Some Franciscans were starting to say that we have a vegetative soul, a sensitive soul, and a rational soul. William thought that was too complicated. He said one soul is enough and it does all the jobs.
So the rational soul takes care of everything.
Exactly. He believed that God puts the rational soul directly into the fetus at some point, and any other souls that might have been there before, they disappear.
Interesting. And what about the body itself?
Well, even though he downplayed the body's role in our identity, he still thought it was a substance with its own form. But that form is influenced by the rational soul.
So they're separate, but they interact.
Exactly. And finally, the big question, is the soul immortal?
Right, that's what everyone wants to know.
And William's answer is a resounding yes. He says the soul's immortality would be obvious if it weren't for sin messing up our understanding. But since we're not perfect, he gives us some philosophical arguments.
All right, let's hear them.
His main argument is that the soul doesn't depend on the body to exist. So when the body dies, the soul keeps on going.
Okay, so it's not like the soul gets destroyed when the body does.
Nope. He also thinks that plant and animal souls are immaterial, but he says they do cease to exist when the body dies because they can't function without the body. The rational soul, though, it can think and will on its own, so it can survive.
And that brings us to those two powers of the rational soul. Intellect and will. Which one did William think was more important?
This might surprise you, but he actually considered the will to be the nobler power.
Really? Even though philosophers usually focus on the intellect.
I know, right? He was kind of puzzled that Aristotle and Avicenna didn't talk more about the will. He thought it was central to human action and morality.
So what was his view of the will then? How did he think it worked?
He used this really cool metaphor. He said the will is like a king and the intellect is like his advisor.
Okay, I like that.
And he said there's a difference between actively willing something, like saying, I will do this, and just having a desire, like saying, I would like this. The will isn't just about desires, it's about making choices. And he really emphasized free will. He said the will can't be forced, either from outside or from inside.
But what about when someone forces you to do something?
He addresses that. He says even if someone tries to force you, your final choice, whether to go along with it or not, that's still free. And he argues that if you refuse to do something, it's because you see it as bad. And if you choose to do something, it's because you see it as good. So in that sense, the will is always free.
Interesting. So no matter what, you always have a choice.
That's what William believed. Now, with the intellect, he was mainly focused on correcting what he saw as errors in earlier thinkers, especially the Greeks and the Islamic philosophers.
So he was very critical of his predecessors.
Very, but sometimes he misunderstood them. He wanted to explain how human knowledge works without relying too much on God intervening in the process, except, of course, for giving us basic truths and revealing things to prophets.
So a mostly naturalistic view of the intellect.
Right. And he absolutely hated the idea of an agent intellect, which some people attributed to Aristotle. He thought it was a bad idea, and he also thought it made the soul too complicated. His own view was that the intellect has this huge potential for knowledge, but it's limited in our current state.
So kind of like our intellect is rusty or something.
Yeah, like it's not working at full capacity. But he thought that in its pure form, the intellect could know everything, even physical things, without using the senses. But here on Earth, we need our senses to learn.
So we're stuck with our imperfect senses for now.
For now, but he did think the intellect can know both general concepts and individual things. He emphasized that it's aimed at truth, especially the truth of God.
So our intellects are ultimately pointing us towards God.
That's right. And he also had this interesting theory about how the intellect works. He said it doesn't contain actual things, but rather signs or representations of things. And these signs, they combine to form our thoughts.
So like a mental language.
Exactly. And he said these signs don't have to be exact copies of the things they represent.